My name is Charlie Gere. I am the Professor of Media Theory and History at Lancaster University. I just want to get the rest of the panel to introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Katrina Sluis and I'm the curator of the digital program at the Photographers Gallery, and I also work part-time as a senior lecturer in digital media at London South Bank University.
Sally Jane Norman, I'm Professor of Performance Technologies and Director of the Attenborough Centre at the University of Sussex.
I'm Douglas Dodds. I'm a senior curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Among other things, I'm very interested in the history of digital images.
Hi, I'm Simon Tanner. I'm the Director of Digital Consultancy and also the Deputy Head of Department for the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London.
Okay, thanks. What I want to do in this session is, firstly, I just want to start off with a few remarks, sort of praising a short document I sent to the other panel members as a way of stimulating conversation, and then throw it open to them to respond, and then finally throw it open to you to maybe respond even further, and to part explain both the image and the title of the session, The Second Bomb. I'm going to start with a quote from Jacques Derrida from a book called The Postcard, which he wrote in 1980. It's just a quote. This is a series of postcards, supposedly, sent to an unnamed lover by possibly Derrida, possibly somebody else, and there's just a little bit of one postcard. An entire epoch of so-called literature, if not all of it, cannot survive a certain technological regime of telecommunications. In this respect, the political regime is secondary. Neither can philosophy, or psychoanalysis, or love letters. We found here the American student with whom we had coffee last Saturday, the one who was looking for a thesis subject, comparative literature. I suggested to her something on the telephone in the literature of the 20th century and beyond, starting with, for example, the telephone lady in Proust, or the figure of the American operator, and then asking the question of the effects of the most advanced telematics, la télématique la plus avancée, on whatever would still remain of literature. I spoke to her about microprocessors and computer terminals. She seemed somewhat disgusted. She told me that she still loved literature. Me too, I answered. Mais si, mais si. Curious to know what she understood by this. So right back in 1980, Derrida has seen that computers are not merely a greater form of technology, or technology enables us to do the things we already do differently or better, but completely changing the whole understanding of the humanities, among other things, in quite dramatic and, as John Norton rightly pointed out, unimaginable ways. Way beyond, I think, anything comparable to print. And the postcard itself, I think, is one of the very best documents in the book, The Postcard, of that change. And J. Hillis Miller says it's how the new regime of telecommunications breaks down the inside-outside dichotomies that preside over the old print culture, such as those in the nation-state, and the new electronic space, the space of television, cinema, telephone, videos, fax. You probably remember fax, then, old technology we used to have. Email, hypertext, internet, has profoundly altered the economies of the self, the home, the workplace, university, and the nation-state's politics. And so the transformations we are having are incredibly dramatic and absolutely unimaginable, I think, and very, very problematic, and not to be taken lightly or regarded in a way that might be purely boosterist or hyperbolic, as I think a lot of discussion around this technology is. And it's also true for the archive, and a term which I use here, not just in its more technical term, but to mean the very way we preserve the material traces of our culture from generation to generation, which means archives, libraries, museums, whatever you want. And one of Derrida's points in a book called Archive Fever is how much this is bound up with finitude, with death, with the breakdown of the spontaneous and alive and eternal experience, and thus part of the death drive. So there's always an issue around finitude, around the fact that things are finite, that they can disappear. And he actually asks in Archive Fever about how psychoanalysis would have changed had, and this tells you the date of the thing, had Freud and his contemporaries had access to MCI and AT&T telephonic credit cards, portable tape recorders, computers, printers, faxes, televisions, teleconferences, and above all, email. So he saw then how much these things are transforming the very way we do discourse and the way we archive it. So why do we call this, I call this session a second bomb? It actually comes out of another Derridian paper called No Apocalypse, Not Now, Full Speed Ahead, 7 Missiles, 7 Missives, in which he talked about the then considerable threat of nuclear destruction, which seems to recede for the moment, which would also mean the remainderless destruction of the archive, the destructive totality of the material trace of human knowledge and of cultural production, and which he thinks is particularly true for literature, which has no referent outside of itself. And we might extend that to arts and humanities, culture altogether. So the nuclear threat may have slightly receded, but there is another threat which is bound up with the nuclear, which is that of the technology which accompanied the making of atomic and nuclear bombs, which is digital technology, which, as we all know, was originally one of its original drives for it being developed was in terms of the Manhattan Project. And I think that the sort of threat he talks about is incredibly vulnerable to the same kind of destruction. And in fact, an electromagnetic pulse of a nuclear war would totally knock out the electronic network telecommunications, which we increasingly rely on, not just for communication, but for archiving. I mean, the digital cloud is like a sort of atomic cloud. It's a bit of a sort of facetious comparison, but there is something there. So curation, which I looked up in my trusty Oxford English Dictionary, has an older meaning care, healing, or cure. And of course, that brings us back to a key word in the Derridean lexicon, that of pharmakon, that something is both, which you used to talk about writing, that something is both something that helps, that cures, but also hinders, that can be destructive. And so it's this double edge around the digital as a place where we curate things, and the archive more generally. I mean, this merely exemplifies and brings a new twist to the more general kind of double edge to the archive of being both remedial and destructive. And this whole notion about how we can, put ourselves at making our archives very vulnerable. The title of this session, The Second Bomb, actually comes from Einstein, who said there were 3 bombs that threatened post-war man. The actual atomic bomb, that's the first one. The third one is a demographic bomb of population. And the second one is the information bomb. So he saw the rise of the computer in quite apocalyptic terms. So in a sense, this is a kind of digital apocalyptics we want to get into here. And what I want, therefore, to lead the discussion is to say to my fellow panelists and to you, what are the implications of the second bomb and the becoming digital of the archive and its vulnerability for our culture? What does it mean that our culture is now increasingly dematerialized, increasingly removed elsewhere, that we're no longer encouraged to put things on a hard disk, but actually have to put them into the cloud, that they are vulnerable to every kind of breakdown when people lose their phones, they lose large parts of their sort of social network, when they lose access to their archives, which are remotely elsewhere, much of their life is gone. When the computer breaks down at university, everybody goes home because there's nothing they can do, so on and so forth. So I thought I'd start with Doug because, in a sense, working at the V&A in the library, you have the closest connection to the more traditional kind of archive as well as digital stuff. So perhaps...
I should just start by saying that although I'm in the department that includes the library,
Sorry.
The Word and Image department at the V&A includes the prints, drawings, paintings, the books, the manuscripts, all the works on paper and increasingly digital objects as well. The V&A's been collecting digital art in a relatively small way for many years, but some 5 or 6 years ago I became increasingly aware that we needed to do more to both have access to that material and to try and ensure that it survives for future generations. Given what we've heard already this morning about the importance of this new digital age that we're in, we wanted to be able to reflect it in the museum and its collections. We're starting to see some images here behind us of works that have come into the V&A's collections in recent years, partly, I have to say, as a result of an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project, which I was involved in with Birkbeck College. And the reason for that project was to identify some of the early works in the history of digital art, try and make sure that they came into public collections and were accessible in some form. In parallel with that, we were also actually digitizing the objects themselves. So you're seeing, ironically, a digital image of an object that was created digitally and then transformed into some other medium and back again, which is a rather sort of convoluted way of trying to explain it. But there are obviously all sorts of issues to do with this. And we're just trying to make sure that we do what we can to acquire those early works. The interesting thing about that is that it then immediately leads you into other things. You start off thinking, well, I'm going to try and capture these works from the 1950s or the 1960s. And then people start giving you more stuff. And one of the unexpected outcomes of the AHRC project was that because people became aware that we were, in effect, the national collection of this material, we were given more and more stuff. And instead of being a problem of trying to identify it, it was trying to prioritize it, trying to arrange it, trying to make it available in a coherent way, which is, another challenge of all this material.
Because I work at the Photographers Gallery, I'm very, very interested in what this means, of course, for images. And we've seen a lot of images today already on the screen and talked about in various different ways. But for me, one of the implications of these shifts is the very big question of where is the image? We've been involved in an analog culture where the tools we use to understand images have been based on discrete, in-framed objects. Even though photography is a medium of reproduction, it's still a very print-based culture. Of course, what network culture does is intensify reproduction. The image is now experienced in rapid volleys, scrolls. It's very difficult to even think about a singular image anymore. And this raises questions for archivists. I know at the Museum of London, they've been thinking about how to archive Twitter. And how do you step into the same stream twice in relation to that? So previous understandings of the audience, the author, the provenance of images and where they come from is a real issue. And then secondly, the claim correspondingly of public museums and galleries to be representational, and where do they fit into this economy of representation, and how do they include and reflect these changes when they are so much built on certain kinds of models based in the Enlightenment about Cartesian rationality? And I think probably, just very briefly, that some of the transformations that we might be seeing are to do with new models in which subject-object relations are not so clear, that we can't, the way we use the image as a model of knowledge will be changing.
Sally Jane.
Yeah, tall order, Charlie. The text that you sent us really buzzed, and I think there were some tenets in there. I want to pull back perhaps more generally to these issues that you described of the archive containing within its structure the seeds of its own destruction, and this question of vulnerability. And I couldn't help wondering whether this is not part of a constant double bind. You know, life is what's leading us constantly towards death, or Walter Benjamin's authenticity of the artwork is only authenticity when it's actually challenged by reproduction strategies. So I'm wondering whether this isn't some sort of a double bind thinking, and whether by the same token, what I would like to do actually is hitch together two of the bombs. I'd rather forget about the first one, the nuclear bomb, but I would like to hitch together the information bomb with the demographic bomb, because I think one of the most interesting things about networks, which is large part of what we're talking about, is the new demographic that they represent, and that they represent affordances for, or that they represent lack of affordance for. And it seems to me that some of the vulnerability that one might associate with networked technologies might come from these incredibly broad and unmanageable networks that John Norton described so brilliantly. But at the same time, this vulnerability might be the basis for a certain kind of resilience. If we are using a new and much broader and much more diversified in the tropical rainforest notion demographic across networks and engaging with very different kinds of human beings, and not just our navel-gazing institutional stalwart places, then perhaps we are, in fact, creating the basis for a very different kind of much more humanly driven resilience. So I think, you know, we've heard about communities of practice. These are old terms. We've heard about legitimated peripheral participation. This came through in the 90s, social theory of networks. But I think the notion of peripheral now is one that we might contest. We're talking about legitimated general participation. We're talking about a much broader notion of participation. So I really see vulnerability as being somehow paired, or I hope it might be paired with a kind of widened resilience. And I think that if we can ensure that the ways we work with and think about networks and data and the caring pharmacon curatorial roles that we might have from our institutional vantage points, if we can think about that as a way of ensuring diversification, then perhaps we are moving into a more resilient model. And just to finish, in my home country, New Zealand, Aotearoa, the word for the internet is, or one of the many words for the internet is raranga tangata, which is the weaving together of the people. I think that's what it's about.
Great, thanks. Simon?
I have to say that this morning, listening to Charlie and also to John, I was struck by almost a counsel of despair and lack of hope. And this sense of, focusing upon risk and not focusing upon consequences and opportunities. And I was very much taken by the sense that, we live in a revolutionary time, but all revolutionary times have had revolutionary leaders. All revolutionary times have had people who've tried to go in different directions. Just because we cannot predict the future hasn't become any less predictable than it was 50 years ago or 2,000 years ago. It is still as unpredictable as it was then. But humans make choices to shape our futures. And I feel that this sense in which, we can't predict what technology is going to mean to us in this environment means, are we actually allowed to actually make some choices then, Because of the risk of this atomic cloud, which is, utterly ridiculous, because frankly, the archive is everyone. The archive is people. It isn't our written culture. The archive is us. We are humanity. Our ability to record and pass on information from one generation to another is one of the gifts that we give to our future generations. If we decide to destroy that, that will also be a human choice. It will be humanity that's made that choice. And so therefore it will, by its very nature, be human. I think there is and there's this focus here upon risk, not upon the consequences. What is it that we lose if we don't have these elements of culture? What is it that we lose if we don't have them available to us? What is the consequence of that loss? You mentioned the Library at Alexandria. I mean, we don't know what we lost, and that's one of the difficulties is knowing what we've lost. And one of the issues that we have to engage with here is not, for me, what are we likely to lose? We need to be thinking about what are we going to keep?
Absolutely.
What are we going to decide to keep? What are we going to make choices about keeping? What are we going to determine for ourselves in terms of our digital futures? And what are we going to discard? Because one of the main issues for us, when we look at the risks to conservation going forward, the traditional risks have always been, war, pestilence, weather, environment, those sorts of things like this. The most likely actual significant risk to our being able to maintain digital resources for the long term is likely to be energy rationing. That's the thing that's incredibly likely to happen. And at that point, it's not going to be about the total loss in this atomic cloud of all of our culture and all of our society. It's going to be about the choices we have to make at that time, about what do we keep, why do we keep it, and for whom do we keep it. And I think that, these perspectives are going to be very important. We're in a battle at the moment between instrumentalist and intangible value perspectives, one which says that culture has intangible value, that we must only preserve things which have instrumentalist values. And we're going to get that challenge. Those battles are going to get greater as we go further into this environment where we suddenly find that the thing that becomes scarce in our environment is our time to engage with materials and the energy that's available to store and maintain those materials. And so I want to sort of just put those out there. And I think I'd also want to just say that, again, we need to not forget that digital has materiality. It does actually exist on something and exist somewhere. And the opportunity that we've got to make multiple copies of it is great. That's one of the opportunities we've never had in our cultural sphere prior to the last 20, 30 years. But the challenge is this fear of losing this information. It's not actually about losing the information. It's about losing our choices. That's the thing we need to be worried about.
Thank you, Simon. I just want to sort of come back a bit on that because I may have overstated the apocalyptic dimension a little bit, and I don't mean to think we are going to lose it or that it's a structural necessity, the possibility of loss of the archive, always. I mean, that's nothing to do with digital in particular, though it changes the dimensions. And as opposed, I take the point about risk entirely, but my point again would be that not knowing the future is also a structural necessity, and not being the future coming towards us in terms of its unpredictability is a structural necessity for there being a future at all. If we could predict it, if it was programmable or programmatically predictable, there would be nothing to happen in that sense. So I'm not in any sense disagreeing, and you're absolutely right also. Take the point about the materiality of the digital. Of course, one of the consequences is that it has environmental impact that is, as yet, we don't quite know what the impact of the kind of, the Silicon Valley might be upon the local environment. That's a different issue. But I will just go back now, if I may, and just sort of précis what seems like a really interesting sort of progression from Doug's looking at what the problem of archiving already pre-existing digital stuff, and there are stories I know about Doug, about Patrick Prince, one of the earlier collectors of digital printouts, actually having to rescue them from behind the printers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory because they are literally regarded as throwaway. And so there's, and then the second question becomes, yes, if we have this stuff, what do we choose and choose not to preserve? And that's also, we cannot predict what will be of interest or might have been of interest in the future. And I think that's a problem we can never solve, but it is one very, pressing towards the whole question of the archive. If I can just sort of go around then to see where you talked about the changing ontology of the kind of artifacts we're dealing with and the old models we use, which may or may not be appropriate and don't fully encompass what it is we're actually looking at or engaging with. Flickr sort of photos, streams on Twitter and all that kind of thing. So we are confronted by a whole series of problems which completely are sort of way beyond the ones you have, literally looking at the original print output of...
Well, yeah, but we're starting with the early works, but then moving forward to the present day and beyond, because at the same time as collecting the early works, we're also collecting contemporary digital artworks, and they have completely different issues.
Yes, exactly.
You're trying to preserve digital information, whereas with the early works, you might be trying to preserve a work on paper that has very fragile paper itself, or the inks are likely to fade if you leave them out for more than a few weeks at a time. So, you're dealing with the preservation, but you're dealing with it in different media.
Yeah. So just go back to, come back to that point, and then Sally talking about new kinds of communities and new sort of ways we open out from particular models, that of centre and periphery, towards a more distributed model that changes what becomes available and what we see. And finally, to Simon's completely correct turn away from the negativity which he sees in me and John Norton, and to a more optimistic view. But I suppose the question I would ask is, maybe coming back to Simon's point, is yes, we have a choice, though it is a feature of the digital world, I think, to feel disempowered of choice to a great extent. And the question might be who chooses and who chooses what for which purpose? How do we decide, given that we have too much rather than too little? I mean, I do take the point that from John Norton that we are in an economy of abundance rather than scarcity. And is there actually a creative role for forgetting, maybe, certain things, as well as trying to remember that we still, and my father was a museum curator, so I was brought up very much in that world.
If I might say, archivists, people assume that archivists are there just to collect things and preserve things. In fact, a lot of the skill, if you like, of being an archivist is to discard things, is to ignore things, to walk away from them, and to just focus your resources on the things that seem likely to be most important.
And maybe the last point there is that if we have a choice, that also brings with it responsibility, the need to respond responsibly to what we are confronted with and make those choices. And I think the difficulty for people dealing with culture at the archival level, or the level of sort of how we make those choices. So I don't know if anybody wants to jump in and respond to Sally Jane.
Yeah, maybe just to try and develop that notion of a wider and more varied demographic, which is a fundamental affordance of digital networks, then perhaps there is an important case to be made for a broader platform whereby the nature of the choices that are being put forward might be discussed. When I talk about a wider demographic, I'm not just talking about the users of the networks themselves. I'm also talking about the populations that are building the hardware that is underpinning those networks, which tend to be probably amongst the most disenfranchised populations on the earth. And I think there is a responsibility, as you rightly put it, for us to be looking at what our ecologies represent in all of their breadth. Louis Beck talks about, he's a French philosopher, talks about techno-zoosemiotics. So we have the technology, we have the semiotic systems, but we also have zoe, life. It's not just techno-semiotics. And I think that looking at this wider, very mixed ecology, which involves technology, semiotics, and living forces of various kinds, and emphasizing varietal diversification, which is a nurseryman's botanist term, as a kind of building in of resilience, is a really important responsibility.
Yes. I think resilience is a very interesting term because as well as being open to the future, we need to make sure the bits that we need to preserve are able to be preserved in appropriate ways. Katrina, do you want to? Oh, then maybe Simon after. Yeah.
I was just thinking about this issue of choice in relation to the mediating figure of software, because of course, much of when we talk about the materiality in one sense of what we're talking about, we're looking at the way in which different cultural artifacts that have been born digital are now software outputs. And of course, not only the design of the tools that we use to make sense of these, the archive, but also distribute it across networks, also has a kind of politics. And I think the politics of code is often absent from discussions of digital transformations, as it gets seen as a black box without any kind of politics. It's just a tool for...
Partly because code is increasingly hidden from us. I mean, very few people now, except in this place, I guess, probably know how to program at any kind of sort of lower level. So there is that issue. Doug, then Simon? Yeah,
I was just remembering something that was written as long ago as 1969, 1970 by Gustav Metzger, the artist who was most famous for auto-destructive art. And he very quickly homed in on this new technology, and he wrote about the technological crisis in art. And he said how difficult it was going to be for museums, galleries, the art market generally, to engage with it and to be able to absorb it within their institutional settings. And, he was right in a sense, of course, but in the intervening years, the art world's moved on. People have begun to understand it more and understand the history of it more.
It does transform the parameters, though, because, the most famous apocalyptic statement about art might be from this day on, painting is dead. Paul de la Roche in 1839 in response to photography. It wasn't true exactly. In some ways, it was not true either. It changed the conditions under which we understood what painting was for and how it worked. And arguably, that's a sort of issue that goes on. Simon?
And I think that these are really important points to be said, because I think there's a challenge which is being faced by people like Doug in the sense, which is, how do they, if you like, atomize, digitize their collections so that they're available to a wider public? But how do they deal with all the collections that are coming in? So how do you curate the future? All these collections that are coming in, or these social networked environments, and engaging with those things which are having a more transitory existence almost as well, and whether recording it actually is a sensible thing is a big question there. I think the aspect of personal loss that we're seeing with people having more experience of engaging with digital content and then their own experiences of losing it is helping to a certain extent move the political agenda along a little bit in terms of how we're able to make our case to key decision makers in terms of what we're trying to preserve. And you can now say, well, you've experienced this. We're trying to ensure that this doesn't happen for our society. But when I think about digital transformations, it occurs to me that there's probably a key thing that's happened which is significantly different, and that is when I think about this sort of environment. I think that we've you know, thinking back to a sort of traditional library concept where we were sort of managing containers of information, so you know, books as containers that work like this. We weren't really managing the information inside it. And then as things became more digital, we started to manage the content. You know, it wasn't just the books, it was what was inside them, you know, in great detail, you know, in that sense, full text in those areas. And I think where we're now at and where the public are really engaging with us is in the area of context, in terms of how these information containers and how the content that they contain relate to our personal context, but also to cultural contexts. And I think if anything's actually at risk in this environment, it's not so much the containers and the content. I think those will find a future. I think it's our understanding of the context. You know, and when we talk about sort of like I've written about the digital dark ages and these sorts of things like this, I put my hand up. I've done the apocalyptic thing as well, you know, like this. But when we talk about that, what I really fear that we will lose is not so much, you know, an email from one person to another, but the context in which that exists, or the tweet from one person to another, but the context in which that exists. The context in which art was created, the context in which film and TV were experienced. I think that is the thing that's actually at risk in this environment.
What I think we might do is go once more and have one more comment each, and then afraid open to the audience, if that's okay. So if I could start, if you have anything more, you may have nothing left to say, Katrina, quite possibly.
Oh, well, I'm just on what you were just saying there about context. I think in relation to the web, it's possible for one image to have many different contexts simultaneously in many different places as it spreads across the network. And I think this is fundamentally something very interesting. And that mapping the topologies across the archive is an interesting shift in those relationships, because there's probably, I would say that even though the mass collection of metadata every day to kind of give context and provenance to images and texts. When we see the way in which tagging and other forms of metadata generation happen on the network, it brings forth the inherent undecidability of the image. It doesn't matter whether you upload your cat to Flickr and tag it with dog or cat, but really it enters an expressive relationship with many other images which have been tagged that way, and we see a shift away from the visual towards the textual and the algorithmic almost in the way in which relationships happen in these platforms.
Yeah, I suppose I just wanted to make sure, as somebody coming from performance and performing arts, that the making and the peculiar vivacity of the live not be forgotten as we talk about the archive and the constituted archive. And I realise that there is also a lot of really interesting work at the moment which has to do with, or wears the badge of, performing the archive, the operability of constituted resources and the ways that these can be trafficked across and made to generate completely new kinds of exchange. I think that's really interesting. At the same time, without being a Luddite, I'm very interested in where it is that live experimentation or experimentation of liveness and testing the boundaries of liveness might generate kinds of resistance, might resist digitization, might generate the sense of poignancy that is, for me, an eminently human sense for us to maintain. So I think there's a very interesting challenge for the arts, certainly, and live and performing arts, to be constantly flagging impossibilities, which are very, very potent possibilities in other social and cultural terms.
Doug?
Well, I'm also interested in the context aspect of this, and you know, people sometimes think, wouldn't it be great if we just archived all this stuff? Or perhaps we just archive these particular websites, or we just archive those particular websites. And of course, as we've already heard, it's often the relationship between the things that's of interest as much as the things themselves. So it's the links that people make between a web page and a Twitter feed and something else that we really want the access to and we want to somehow maintain, which is very problematic to do, of course.
I'm going to reiterate what I said about choices. I think that the choices really matter because what we choose to digitize and what we choose not to digitize, when we look at any of our major memory institutions, it's worth thinking not just what have they digitized. When we look at a National Archive digitizing census materials, we look at a National Library digitizing newspaper materials, etc. We need to also think about what they're not digitizing, because that is a choice that's being made, and sometimes those choices are being made on our behalf. And we need to think about where the citizen is in terms of those choices. And the aspect there is also in terms of which aspects of our lives are we willing to engage in social experiences in the digital environment, and which aspects of our lives aren't we willing to engage with. I mean, I would say that in some respects, live performance has been enhanced by the digital in that sense of becoming a bit more Elizabethan in our that we're actually on the stage as part of the performance, not just, you know, as a recipient being broadcast to, you know, in that aspect. But I think, you know, the real interesting area here is to look at the gaps. Not so much what are we doing, but look at what we're not doing and why we're not choosing, why we're making the choices we're making. And I think we need to be thinking to ourselves about those gaps and about those choices, and considering whether we're being purposeful about those choices in the future.
So it's really a question of who chooses, what gets chosen, and who or what gets left out, I guess, is the kind of...
I think there's all sorts of power structures there, yes.
Yes, I mean, which we need. So I think I'd like to throw it open the last sort of 15, 20 minutes to the audience. I'd like to have the lights brought up slightly in the audience, so we're not the only people being blinded. No? Okay. Oh, yes, thank you. Who would like to start off? The lady, woman with the red scarf? Yes? You can say your name as well, just so we... and where you come from.
Hello everybody, my name's Tag McIntaggart. I'm here as an independent, but I also do some work for Intermedia Europe. I've got three things that just jumped out at me, and it was a really, really stimulating discussion. Thank you all very much. One was to do with the concept of resilience, and I'm interested that Nicholas Nassim Taleb currently is developing the concept of what he calls anti-fragility, which he defines as different from resilience. Resilience is being able to put up with or being able to resist what is thrown at you, or the dangers that you face or the risks that you take. Whereas anti-fragility relates more to what John Norton was talking about this morning, of accepting that we live in an era of total disruption, constant movement and change. But we can either view that as destructive, and part of it is, or we can view it like ploughing up very, very packed earth, compacted earth, in order to plant new seeds. You have to plough, you have to completely churn up the land in order to plant those new seeds. So I'm interested about the turning the notion of resilience, which is somehow or other more negative. It's like being able to resist, into something much more proactive, which is what Taleb is grasping for with the concept of anti-fragility. So we build ourselves to be anti-fragile all the time, to withstand and accept and indeed embrace that disruption. The second was Marge Piercy, in one of her novels in 1981 called Woman on the Edge of Time, predicted the sense of identity and technology becoming entwined when she came up with the idea of what she called a kenner, K-E-N-N-E-R, which was like a wrist gauntlet that you wore on your arm that held the whole of your life's history in technological form. Your memories, your experiences, photographs, all of your documentation, etc. And she predicted or foresaw a time when, if you lost your kenner or in battle had your arm cut off, that there were people who might choose not to live any longer because they no longer had that connection to their identity. And that book has stayed with me, and I think the notion of identity and technology is something that we're nowhere near getting to grips with, particularly in terms of what it means for the young generation. And the third thing is about data storage, because it seems to me you can only have choices about what data you store if you know that you have the material capacity to make that data storage. And that's what's exercising engineers at the moment. That the daily backup, for example, of the data that is churned out by CERN as a single institution daily, and the backup of that information daily is already stretching the engineering ability of data storage. So the ways in which we think about data storage, and everything has its materiality, I agree entirely. There's no such thing as the cloud. Somewhere the cloud is being stored materially. And that notion, the notion that's come into the press very recently about creating data storage on genes, on tissue, on actual human tissue, which takes me into the techno-zooey semiotics, if I've understood it right, seems to me to be one of those other sort of left-field ideas, that you store something in tiny little packets on tissue rather than on, you know, sort of engineering materials. These are ramblings. I'm sorry I've gone on so long, but this is what you've triggered for me, is just really rich stimulation about so many aspects of the problems that we're facing.
I think but maybe quickly about, I mean, there's a flip side to the resilience, anti-fragility thing. It's the difference between flexibility in employment and precarity, those two terms that get kind of flipped around. So yes, there is, of course, we have all sorts of reasons to greet this possibly as a good thing to some extent, but at the same time there are issues around what's expected of us in our lives that we now, very few people, except for tenured academics, have you know, the notion of having a reasonably secure job, and even they don't particularly. Do you want to say anything about any of these points?
Yeah, I think your notion of anti-fragility is a really interesting one. I associate a kind of a bounciness with resilience. I like the idea of bouncing back. And I get the point about anti-fragility. At the same time, I'm very concerned about all these terms, which is why I'm grateful that you've flagged to us some of the subtleties of these nuances in language. If we use these terms without their metadata contexts, then we can very quickly go up the wrong road, because I was opposing or trying to this notion of vulnerability with this notion of resilience, coming back to Charlie's initial text. And at the same time, I think that vulnerability does need to be seized as a quality, because vulnerability is what brings out our protective instincts. And fragility, and I'm not wanting to knock your contribution to the table of this word, but fragility is likewise an extremely important cultural value in certain contexts. So for me, what I'm taking away from your input is that you've pointed us to the subtleties and the differentiations of language. Thank you.
To be clear, it's not my concept.
No. No, you were incredibly rigorous in citing.
The Black Swan man, in other words. Yeah. I mean, the Black Swan guy. Yeah, okay. Well, his contingency is his sort of central point. Does any other panel want to respond to any of those points? We're happy to move on to any other questions. Yes, there's one at the front row, one there, and then one there. One there first.
Hello, my name's David Henker-Reid. I'm a graduate student at University College London. I'll try and be quicker as well. The kind of main topic which I think you're all kind of bridging is the idea of choice, the idea of what gets chosen and who chooses it. And obviously encoded into that is the idea of value. And I think it's important to consider the idea of kind of implicit and explicit value, because to me it strikes me the idea that what we might call more traditional art, or performing arts or gallery exhibitions, have been encoded with an idea of high art. They encode so much powerful emotion and so much high value, and yet they struggle in both financial and social terms for relevancy, for audiences, whilst the low arts of video games, of scribbles on Twitter, I think with the Wii U, which was released yesterday and is very much based on tablet controls, and so a lot of its games are based on making little pictures. This is things which millions upon millions upon millions of people played, but is completely temporal, partly because it's considered low art. And something I'm interested in is, well, firstly, could you comment on that? Could you comment on value? But also, do you think it's perhaps something that will transform, whether or not there will be a change in kind of old dictum of high and low art, in who chooses what and what gets chosen?
I think that's a really interesting question. I've got a response to it. I'm sure we all have to some extent. As quickly since I'm chair, I can is just to say that I think that's interesting. The idea of high art is itself invention of the modern era, so it is by no means a sort of idea that's universal or internal, whatever. Museums are quite popular, galleries are popular. They're not popular like video games, but Tate has, what, 4 million visitors a year or something? I mean, you go to a gallery and it's not empty, unfortunately. I wish it was, because whatever. But I don't think I can criticise them for being unpopular exactly, not the same sort of proportion of popularity.
If I could just comment on that as well. I entirely understand what you're saying. Some of the images that you've been looking at on the screen there were completely disregarded by the art establishment at the time when they were created. You know, in the 60s in particular, people who were known as computer artists were completely ignored by the gallery system, by the art market. They really struggled to find a way of engaging with the audience and making their work in any way sort of economic. We look at it now in a different way, and I'm sure the same will be true of video games, looking back at the early history of video games, for example. So it's absolutely important that somebody somewhere does capture those types of current cultural activity. The trouble is they're very specialist areas, and you need to have very specialist skills to be able to acquire the stuff, know what to acquire, and to have some guarantee that it's going to continue to be available.
Thank you for asking that question, because value is where I spend most of my time thinking and working. I mean, particularly in this area, there are so many different values that one could put on the table, in terms of things such as democratizing access, equality and equity, as well as health and well-being. But for me, what I've been doing recently and focusing on is looking at the way in which we engage with digital resources has reflected within it a set of modes of cultural value. And I use the word modes very importantly, because I think it's important to state that anything I'm about to say is not an exclusive list. It is my sense of where the priorities and the focus of people in the community and in those who are creating content lies. And I've put that into 5 modes of cultural value, which is, we can talk about the utilitarian value of the value we get from using something, but we can also talk about the value of education, our ability to learn something new, to move on our thoughts, the opportunity that digital provides for community values, our ability to enhance a community through the use of digital in some way, or make a community stronger, a sense of place, sense of community, that sort of aspect. But we should also remember that that there's an existence value as well. So people value the existence of things, even if they don't personally use them. So we can go beyond just utilitarian values to say, I value that thing even if I don't use it. St. Paul's Cathedral, I've never been in, but I like the fact that it's there, sort of thing like this, But there's also economic values, how are we made more wealthy in some way, along those lines. But the one that I would add, which is maybe slightly unusual, is the idea of inheritance and bequest. I think within this context and the choices that we're making, we are faced with a situation where we are inheriting an awful lot of things. We have literally thousands of years of inheritance that's expressed in the memory organizations, but also expressed in all of us in terms of the knowledge that we bring into the world and carry forward. And it's what are we going to bequeath to the next generation? And I think that's going to be one of the most essential values for us to take forward.
Yeah.
Oh, just quickly, I completely agree with your comments, and I think what you're seeing within cultural organisations and certainly curatorial practice is a kind of crisis of cultural authority, and which relates to my earlier comments about the museum's claims to be representational within the dissolved, diffused computational culture that we find ourselves in.
Any comments on value?
I think the values question is a really interesting one, and to come back to something that Katrina said earlier, that there are multiple different contexts that can be associated with phenomena at any given point in time. I think the ways that one contextualizes one's values system are infinite. And we've been looking at this at seminars a number of times at Sussex, and notions of temporal windows. What kinds of temporal windows does one bring to bear on the object about whose value one is reflecting? Or what kinds of broader cultural windows or niche cultural windows might one bring to bear in making assumptions about values? It's a really rich question.
I think we'll have one more question, if there is one. Oh, yeah, there's one. Yes, there was one already. And then we'll wrap up.
My name's Andrew Dewdney from London South Bank University, and it really follows on from the last question of cultural value, because it seems to me everything is changing this morning, but then everything is still in place in terms of the organizations, the institutions, the places from where authority kind of emanates, you know, as a group of people who have kind of authority, all of us in this room and in the panel now. And I just wonder where you think, or whether you think, that one of the aspects of digital transformation is to challenge cultural authority at the kind of organizational level of the institution. And the second thing I'd like some kind of elaboration on is who is the we? You know, the we becomes very, very problematic, it seems to me, when we talk about you know, the new ecology, the biodiversity that we're all part of. You know, it seems to me that the notion of citizen, the notion of public space, are problematized by this, and so I'd be very interested to know what you think about that.
Should we go, Katrina, who wants to jump in first on that? Because that's a very interesting question. Anybody feel immediately? The question of the fact that the institutions of authority remain similar, or the same, V&A, for example. Yeah,
I could say something, perhaps.
Go on.
Yeah, just that, you know, I see this from a number of different angles, I suppose, because a lot of people expect institutions to move into these new territories that we've been talking about, but at the same time, they also expect us to continue to maintain the old stuff that we were always known for. And an example of that is the need to, if you like, migrate a lot of analog information into the digital age. Everybody takes it for granted that this stuff is just going to be available when, in fact, an awful lot of effort has to go into just doing that, never mind moving into these new areas that we've been discussing. And my view on that is that, you know, for instance, most museums, many libraries, many archives, well, archives certainly, hold unique documents. It's really in everybody's interest that we focus on those unique documents and get them into the public domain online so that the researchers in this room have access to them. If you can do more than that, then obviously that's good. But as a minimum, we need to make sure that those documents that we already have can survive in some way.
Any subject?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the authority question, which I think is a really important one. And of course, there's nothing more hideous than a university professor making demagogic statements about demographic diversification, which is exactly what I'm sort of doing. And I'm very interested in this notion of network affordances generating platforms for potentially a much broader kind of social exchange and input. And I think we have to be incredibly mindful of this. I get very worried in the current social and educational context where questions of engagement, questions of so-called outreach and widening participation become sort of key performance indicators for universities to, you know, glean a bit more funding. I find there's something quite disturbing about this, and that there have to be terms whereby we who have the good fortune to be within academies and to be in high levels of intellectual exchange and creative exchange with colleagues, that we have to be a little bit more rigorous about how we define our own specificities and how we position them so that they put out handles for engaging with other people who have at least as much to say as we have.
You don't have to say something, but if you have anything to say...
very quickly. I think there is a pressure for participatory and collaborative frameworks, but the way in which participation and collaboration is constructed is a really important idea. And as someone who, well, for example, has just curated a show on cat photography, which could be either seen as a populist, democratic kind of show, or a critical look at the dissemination and viral nature of the network and this overlooked popular form of photography.
Yeah, fair enough.
I quite like this challenge to authority. I think it's a good thing. I think because there's an element here where it brings more people into the conversation. It allows more people to be part of the discussion and part of the definition of what value and success is. And I think that just in the same way that, as was mentioned earlier, the Old Bailey session papers and the work that Tim Hitchcock and Bob Shoemaker have done have started to reconfigure history from the perspective of, you know, individuals, and taking away the only way of looking at history is from the elite's perspectives. I think it's adding to that aspect. I think there's too much of our consideration in the digital world which looks at this as being an either or rather than an and. And I think that the more we add rather than try and make it an either or, you know, a museum is the only person that can have authority, or an academic is the only person who can have authority, as opposed to a museum can have authority in the things they're authoritative in, and an academic can have things they're authoritative in, and a member of the public who's never had an academic career can be authoritative in those areas. You know, I can be very authoritative about aspects of certain science fiction authors and know nothing at all about other aspects of those things, but I have no academic background in those areas. And similarly, there are lots of people out there who know more about art than some of the curators who are there as bastions and gatekeepers of those cultural objects. So I don't think that this needs to be an either or. I think in this situation, the more that we can and communities and stakeholders and people who care about culture, the better.
I fear we've run out of time, which is a great shame, so we're going to have to stop there. But I'd like to thank my really fascinating panel members, and so if you give them a big hand or a small hand. And say thank you. Okay, good.